You didn't lose them. You lost control of something much deeper, something you never even realized you were inside of. Because if you're honest, it never made sense. The way they could be so close one moment and completely gone the next. The way a single message from them could calm your entire body, and then their silence could slowly tear it apart again. You told yourself it was just timing. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were dealing with something. Maybe if you just stayed patient, stayed understanding, stayed the version of yourself that never asked for too much, things would eventually settle into something real. But they never did. It always circled back to the same feeling, that quiet tension sitting in your chest, the one that shows up when something feels off, but you don't have enough proof to call it what it is. So you wait, you analyze, you replay conversations in your head, you try to find the exact moment things shifted, the exact sentence you could have said differently, the version of yourself that would have made them stay consistent. And without realizing it, you start shrinking, just a little at first, adjusting your tone, your timing, your expectations, convincing yourself that this is what connection requires, that real connection is supposed to feel uncertain, unpredictable, something you have to earn over time. But here is the part no one tells you, the part that changes everything once you see it clearly. You are not confused because they are complicated. You are confused because you are trying to find logic inside a pattern that was never designed to be stable. You think you are dealing with a person with their emotions, their intentions, their inconsistency, but what if that is not what is actually happening? What if what you are experiencing is not a relationship, but a loop that begins the moment they show you just enough attention to feel something real, just enough presence to make you believe there is potential, and then disappears before that potential ever becomes reality. And in that gap, your mind does something automatic. It starts searching for completion. It starts trying to close the loop, because the human brain is not built to sit comfortably in unfinished patterns. It wants resolution, it wants clarity, it wants an ending that makes sense. And when it does not get that, it holds on tighter. That is why you cannot just walk away, not because they are perfect, not because they are the only one, but because your system is trying to solve something that feels incomplete. And every time they come back, even for a moment, even with something small, a message, a reaction, a sudden shift in attention, it feels like relief, not love, relief. Like something inside you finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. And that relief is what keeps you attached, not who they are, but what they represent inside that loop. Because when they are present, the tension disappears. When they are gone, it comes back stronger. And slowly, without realizing it, your emotional state starts depending on their behavior. Your peace is no longer yours. It is something that fluctuates based on how close or distant they decide to be. And from the outside, it looks like you are just dealing with someone inconsistent. But internally, something much deeper is happening. Your nervous system is being trained. It is learning that connection comes with uncertainty, that closeness comes with withdrawal, that attention is something that can be given and taken away at any moment. And once that pattern sets in, it starts to feel familiar, not safe, but familiar. And the most dangerous thing about something familiar is that you stop questioning it. You start adapting to it instead. You stop asking why it feels this way, and you start asking how you can make it work, how you can be more patient, more understanding, more aligned with what they need, so that maybe this time it will stabilize, but it never does. Because the instability is not a phase, it is the structure. And the more you try to fix it, the deeper you get pulled into it. You begin to measure your worth based on their responses, to interpret their silence as something you did wrong, to believe that if you just find the right version of yourself, the one that does not trigger their distance, everything will finally fall into place. But that version of you does not exist, because the problem was never you to begin with. And this is where the truth starts to shift, where everything you thought you understood begins to crack just enough for you to see what is really there. You were never chasing them. You were chasing the moment when they almost chose you. And that moment is powerful because it feels close enough to real that you can imagine what it would be like if it stayed. But it never stays, it resets. over and over again. And each time it does, the loop tightens just a little more until one day you realize something that feels uncomfortable at first, almost impossible to accept. You are not stuck because you cannot let go of them. You are stuck because your mind has not learned how to let go of the pattern yet. And once you see that, once you stop looking at them as the center of this experience and start looking at the loop itself, everything begins to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, the way real shifts always happen. Because the moment you recognize that this is not connection, but a cycle that feeds on uncertainty, and almost you stop asking the question that has been keeping you trapped this entire time. You stop asking why they keep pulling away, and you start asking something much more important. Why does this feel so hard to walk away from? It never happens all at once. That's the part that makes it so hard to see. It starts small, almost harmless, the way they show up in the beginning, attentive, present, just enough to make you feel chosen without ever fully committing to it. They text back quickly, they mirror your energy, they say things that feel real, not perfect, but real enough that you start to relax just a little. And in that moment, something inside you opens, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for you to lean in, enough for you to start investing emotionally. And that's when the shift begins. Not immediately, not in a way you can clearly point to, but gradually, subtly, their responses slow down, their tone changes, their presence becomes inconsistent. One day they are there, the next they are distant, and you tell yourself it's normal. People have lives, people get busy, not everything means something. So you stay calm, you give space, you try to be understanding, but then it happens again and again and again. And each time it does, something inside you reacts a little faster, a little stronger. You start checking your phone more often, not because you want to, but because your body feels like it needs to. You reread old messages, looking for clues, looking for reassurance that what you felt before was real. You notice the gaps, the delays, the slight changes in how they speak to you, and your mind begins to fill in the blanks. Maybe you said too much. Maybe you moved too fast. Maybe you became too available. And without realizing it, you start adjusting. You hold back a little. You think twice before sending something. You try to match their pace instead of trusting your own. But the pattern doesn't stabilize, it intensifies. Because every time they pull away, your attention moves closer. And every time they come back, even briefly, it resets everything. The doubt disappears, the anxiety drops, and for a moment, everything feels okay again. And that moment becomes addictive, not because it's perfect, but because it relieves the tension that built up when they were gone. And now you're not just experiencing connection, you're experiencing contrast, high and low, presence and absence, certainty and confusion. And your system starts chasing the high, the feeling of them being there, responding, engaging, choosing you, even if it's only temporary. You begin to wait for it, to anticipate it, to depend on it more than you want to admit. And this is where the loop tightens, because now it's not just about them anymore. It's about how you feel when they shift. The moment they go quiet, your mind activates. You replay the last interaction, searching for mistakes. You analyze their words, their tone, the timing of their responses. You compare it to how they were before, trying to understand what changed. And the more you think, the more you find reasons that point back to you that you did something wrong, that you triggered their distance, that if you were just slightly different, this wouldn't be happening. And that belief keeps you engaged, because if the problem is you, then the solution is also you. So you stay, you try harder, you become more patient, more flexible, more willing to tolerate things that don't feel right, because you believe it will eventually lead to stability. But stability never comes, only moments that feel like it might. And those moments are enough to keep you from leaving, because each time they return, it feels like progress, like something is finally moving in the right direction, like all the confusion before had a purpose, but it didn't. It was just part of the cycle. Pull in, pull away, close, then distant, just enough to keep you engaged, never enough to let you rest. And over time, this starts affecting more than just your thoughts. It changes how you feel. in your own body. You become hyper aware, sensitive to every shift, every delay, every inconsistency. Your mood starts to depend on something outside of you. A message can lift you, silence can drop you. And the worst part is, you know something isn't right. You feel it, that quiet discomfort that never fully leaves. But you don't trust it, because every time you're about to step back, they reappear. And when they do, everything softens again. You tell yourself you are overthinking, that maybe this time it will be different, that maybe they just needed space. And so the loop continues, not because you're weak, not because you don't see it, but because the pattern is designed to keep you in a constant state of almost understood, almost chosen, almost stable. And almost is powerful because it keeps you alive without ever delivering certainty. It gives you just enough to stay, but never enough to feel secure. And the longer you stay in that space, the harder it becomes to separate what is real from what you are trying to make real. You start confusing intensity with connection, uncertainty with depth, emotional highs and lows with meaning. But what you're actually experiencing is a system that feeds on your attention, your patience, your willingness to stay in something unresolved. And every time you go through the cycle again, it reinforces itself. It tells your mind, this is what connection feels like. This is what you should expect. This is what you should tolerate. And slowly, without realizing it, your baseline shifts. What once felt uncomfortable starts to feel normal. And what is actually calm, stable, consistent starts to feel unfamiliar, even boring. And that's how the loop traps you, not by force, but by conditioning, not by taking something from you, but by teaching you to accept less than what you actually need. And by the time you begin to question it deeply, you're already emotionally invested, already attached to the rhythm of it, already used to the cycle of waiting, receiving, losing, and hoping again. And the hardest part is none of this feels like a pattern while you're inside it. It feels like a story, your story, with a person you believe just hasn't fully aligned with you yet. But the truth is, it's not about alignment. It's about repetition. And until you see that clearly, the loop doesn't break. It just keeps finding new ways to pull you back in. If you slow everything down and look at it without the emotion for just a moment, the pattern starts to reveal something uncomfortable, something most people never fully admit to themselves. This isn't random. It's not bad luck. It's not just that you keep meeting the wrong people. There is a system underneath all of this, a system that was built long before you ever met them. Because the way you respond to inconsistency, the way you hold on to something that keeps pulling away, the way you try to understand instead of walking away, that didn't start here. It started much earlier. And the same is true for them, because on the other side of this dynamic is someone who isn't confused in the same way you are. They're not overthinking every message. They're not trying to stabilize the connection. They're not asking themselves how to make this work. What they're doing is something much more automatic, something wired into how they learn to experience closeness. For some people, connection doesn't feel safe. It feels exposing. The moment things start to become real, the moment someone begins to see them clearly, something inside their system activates. Not consciously, not in a way they sit and think about, but instinctively their body reads closeness as a form of pressure, intimacy as a loss of control. And so they move closer just enough to feel something, and then they pull back to regulate themselves. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they feel too much in a way they were never taught how to hold. And on the surface, it looks like inconsistency, but underneath, it's regulation. Their nervous system is trying to maintain equilibrium by controlling distance. Too far, they feel disconnected. Too close, they feel overwhelmed. So they oscillate back and forth. And when you enter that pattern, especially as someone who experiences connection differently, the interaction becomes perfectly misaligned. because where they pull away to feel safe, you move closer to feel secure. Where they need space to regulate, you interpret that space as loss, and so you respond. You try to close the gap. You try to bring things back to what they were when it felt stable. But that stability, the one you remember, was never stable to begin with. It was just the part of the cycle where both of your systems briefly aligned. And this is where your side of the pattern comes into focus. Because the way you respond to their distance is not neutral. It's driven by something just as deep. You don't just want connection. You need resolution. You need clarity. You need to understand why something shifted, why something that felt real suddenly feels uncertain. And that need is powerful. It doesn't just sit in your thoughts, it moves through your body. It keeps you engaged, keeps you analysing, keeps you trying to restore what was lost. And often that need was shaped long before this situation, in environments where emotional consistency wasn't guaranteed, where attention came and went, where understanding wasn't always reciprocated. You learn to read between the lines, to sense changes, to adapt quickly, to maintain connection even when it wasn't stable. And that ability, that sensitivity became part of how you relate. So when someone enters your life and creates a similar rhythm, it doesn't just feel familiar, it feels meaningful. Like something important is happening. Like there is something here you're supposed to figure out, fix, or complete. But what's actually happening is simpler and more mechanical than it feels. Two nervous systems, each trying to regulate themselves, but doing it in opposite directions. One moves away to feel safe, the other moves closer to feel secure. And that push and pull creates intensity, not depth, intensity. And intensity is easy to confuse with connection because it feels strong, it feels consuming, it feels like it matters. But intensity doesn't mean stability, it doesn't mean alignment. It just means there is a lot of activation happening at once. And the more activated you become, the harder it is to step back and see the pattern clearly, because your focus narrows. You start looking for signals, for signs, for anything that tells you where you stand. And every small shift becomes significant. A delayed response means something. A shorter message means something. A sudden return means everything. And this constant interpretation keeps your system engaged in a loop that feels personal but is actually structural, because neither of you is operating from a place of calm, stable connection. You are both responding to internal triggers that shape how you approach closeness. And until those patterns are seen for what they are, they don't change, they repeat. With the same person or with someone new who fits the same dynamic, that's why it can feel like you keep ending up in the same situation, even when the faces are different. Because what you're experiencing isn't just about them. It's about what your system is drawn to, what it recognizes, what it tries to resolve. And here's the part that shifts everything once you really understand it. You are not reacting to who they are. You are reacting to what they activate in you. And what they activate is tied to something unfinished. Something your mind believes it can finally complete if you just stay long enough, try hard enough, understand deeply enough. But that completion never comes, because the pattern itself is not designed to resolve. It's designed to continue to keep both sides in motion, adjusting, reacting, never fully settling. And the more you try to stabilize it from your side, the more the imbalance becomes clear, because stability cannot be created unilaterally. It requires two people who can both remain present without needing to escape or chase. And when that isn't there, no amount of awareness, patience, or effort from one side can compensate for it. And that's why this feels so exhausting, not just emotionally, but physically, because your system is constantly switching states, calm when they're present, activated when they're gone, hopeful when they return, anxious when they pull away again. And over time, that fluctuation becomes your normal. But it was never meant to be. It's just the result of two patterns colliding in a way that creates movement without resolution. And once you begin to see it like that, not as a story about two people trying to make something work, but as a system that keeps reinforcing itself, the question changes. It's no longer about why they act the way they do. it becomes about why this pattern has so much control over how you feel. And that question is where everything begins to shift. At some point, without even realizing it, you made a quiet decision, not a conscious one, not something you sat down and thought through, but something your behavior started reflecting over time. You decided that if you just understood them enough, if you stayed patient enough, if you didn't push too hard, didn't ask for too much, didn't react too quickly, eventually something would shift. Eventually they would feel safe enough to stay, and that belief feels reasonable. It feels mature. It feels like you're being emotionally intelligent, like you're giving the connection space to grow instead of forcing it into something it's not ready to become. But here is where the trap really begins. And it's subtle, almost invisible, unless you step far enough back to see it clearly. Because what you call patience is slowly turning into tolerance. What you call understanding is quietly becoming justification. And what you call hope is actually keeping you anchored to something that has never been stable from the start. You're not just waiting for them to change. You're investing in the idea that your effort can influence their behavior, that your consistency can correct their inconsistency, that your presence can somehow regulate something inside them that was never yours to manage. And that belief is powerful because it gives you a sense of control. It tells you this situation is still within your reach, that if you just get it right, if you just find the right balance between giving space and showing up, everything will finally align. But it never does. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because the system itself doesn't respond to effort in the way you think it does. This isn't a problem you can solve with more awareness, more patience, or more emotional availability, because what you're inside of is not a linear situation where effort leads to outcome. It's a loop, and loops don't resolve through effort. They repeat through reinforcement. Every time you stay after they pull away, the loop strengthens. Every time you accept inconsistency as something temporary, the loop deepens. Every time you reinterpret their distance as something you can understand instead of something you should step back from, you feed the cycle again. And here's the part that changes everything once you see it. You're not trying to fix the connection. You're trying to complete a pattern your mind refuses to leave unfinished. That's why it feels so intense. That's why it's so hard to walk away even when you know something isn't right, because your brain isn't just reacting to them, it's reacting to the absence of closure. And the human mind is wired to seek closure at almost any cost. When something starts and doesn't resolve, it creates tension. And that tension doesn't go away on its own. It stays active, pulling your attention back to it, keeping you engaged, keeping you invested in finding an ending that makes sense. And in this dynamic, that ending never arrives. Instead, what you get are fragments, moments where it feels like things are finally coming together, followed by distance that resets everything again. And those moments act like rewards, not consistent ones, unpredictable ones. And that unpredictability is what makes it addictive, because when a reward is inconsistent, your brain pays more attention, not less. It starts scanning for patterns, trying to predict when the next moment of closeness will come, trying to figure out what triggers it, what causes it, what version of you brings it back. And slowly, without realizing it, your focus shifts completely. You're no longer asking if this connection is right for you. You're asking how to keep it from disappearing. And that's the trap, because the more you focus on maintaining it, the less you question whether it should be maintained at all. You become invested in the cycle itself, in the rise and fall, in the tension and release. And what feels like emotional depth is actually just repeated activation. You feel a lot, but that doesn't mean what you're feeling is stable or real in the way you think it is. It just means your system is engaged at a high level, and high engagement can be mistaken for meaning. But meaning requires consistency. It requires presence that doesn't disappear the moment things start to deepen. It requires someone who can stay when it matters, not just show up when it's easy. And in this loop, that consistency is never there, only the illusion of it, just enough to keep you from leaving. And that's why trying harder doesn't work, because effort doesn't change the structure. It only keeps you inside it longer. The loop doesn't break when you finally say the right thing or act the right way. It breaks when you stop feeding it, when you stop responding to inconsistency as something to solve and start recognizing it as something to step away from. But until that shift happens, the trap holds quietly, not through force, but through your own willingness to stay engaged with something that keeps resetting before it ever becomes real. And the hardest part is it doesn't feel like a trap while you're inside it. It feels like possibility, like something that's just not quite there yet, like something worth waiting for. But what you're actually waiting for is a version of the dynamic that has never existed. And the more you wait, the more you reinforce the belief that it eventually will, until one day, if you're honest enough to see it, you realize you were never moving closer to clarity. You were just moving deeper into the loop. There's a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, but internally it changes everything. It doesn't happen when they finally explain themselves, because they usually don't. It doesn't happen when you get closure, because that rarely comes in the way you expect. It happens in something much quieter, much more subtle. It happens when you start noticing that nothing about this is new anymore. The same conversations, the same distance, the same return, the same hope rising and collapsing in the exact same rhythm. At first, you still try to give it meaning. You tell yourself every situation is different, every person is different, every connection deserves its own chance. But then something shifts, not emotionally, but observationally. You stop looking at what they're saying and you start looking at what keeps repeating. And once you see repetition clearly, it becomes harder to romanticize it, because patterns don't lie. They don't depend on interpretation. They don't change based on how you feel. They just show you what is consistently happening beneath everything else. And what you begin to see is uncomfortable, not because it's painful, but because it's simple, too simple for all the effort you've been putting into it. You see that no matter how much you adjust, the outcome doesn't change. You see that no matter how patient you are, the inconsistency remains. You see that the connection only feels good when it's being reintroduced, not when it's being sustained. And that realization creates a kind of tension that's different from before. It's no longer confusion. It's clarity that you're not fully ready to accept yet. Because once you accept it, something else has to change, and that something is you, not in the way you've been trying to change, not by becoming more understanding or more accommodating, but by stepping out of the role you've been playing in the pattern. And that's where resistance shows up, because a part of you still wants it to work. A part of you still believes that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time they'll stay. Maybe this time all the effort will finally lead to something stable. And letting go of that belief feels like giving up, like walking away before the story reaches its conclusion. But here's the truth that begins to settle in when you sit with it long enough. There is no conclusion waiting at the end of this pattern. There is only continuation. And the only thing that determines how long it continues is how long you stay engaged with it. That's the turning point, not when they change, but when you stop expecting them to, when you stop measuring progress based on their behavior and start measuring it based on your awareness. Because awareness is the first real shift. It doesn't immediately free you. It doesn't instantly remove the attachment, but it changes how you experience the dynamic. You start to feel the pull without automatically responding to it. You notice the urge to check your phone, to analyze, to wait, but there's a slight gap now, a small space between the feeling and the action. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Choice. Not perfect choice, not consistent yet, but enough to begin interrupting the pattern. You might still respond, still engage, still feel the same emotional spikes, but now you're seeing it while it happens. And that awareness slowly weakens the loop, because patterns rely on unconscious participation. The moment you start seeing them clearly, they lose some of their power. Not all at once, but gradually. The highs don't feel as convincing. The returns don't feel as meaningful. The distance doesn't feel as confusing. It starts to feel predictable. And predictability changes everything. Because once something is predictable, it stops feeling like possibility and starts feeling like repetition. And repetition doesn't hold the same emotional weight as potential. It doesn't create the same hope. It just shows you what is. And what is in this case is something that doesn't evolve, something that doesn't deepen, something that doesn't stabilize no matter how much time or energy you give it. And that's where the shift becomes real. Not because you suddenly feel detached, but because you can no longer pretend that this is leading somewhere different. You begin to understand that the connection you were holding on to was not built on mutual consistency, but on intermittent reinforcement. That what kept you there was not what was present, but what was almost present. And once you see that, your focus starts to change. You stop asking how to make this work, and you start asking why you've been trying to make something unstable feel secure. And that question doesn't have a simple answer. It leads you back into yourself, into your own patterns, your own expectations, your own tolerance for uncertainty. But it also gives you something you didn't have before: direction. Because now the problem is no longer external. It's not about fixing them, understanding them, or waiting for them. It's about understanding what kept you in the loop in the first place. And that's where real change begins. Not in the relationship, but in your relationship to the pattern itself. Because once you stop seeing it as something that might eventually resolve and start seeing it as something that repeats until you step out of it, the question becomes unavoidable. Not whether they will come back, but whether you will still be there when they do. The shift doesn't look like strength at first. It doesn't feel like power, and it definitely doesn't feel like freedom. In fact, the first time it happens, it feels unnatural, almost wrong, because everything in you is still wired to respond the old way. The urge is still there, the instinct to check, to reach out, to close the distance the moment it appears. But this time, something interrupts it. Not forcefully, not dramatically, just enough to slow it down. A pause. And in that pause, you begin to realize something you couldn't see before. You don't actually have to respond to everything you feel. That alone changes more than you expect. Because for so long, every emotional shift triggered an action. They pulled away, you leaned in. They went quiet, you started thinking. They came back, you opened up again. It was automatic. But now there's a gap, and inside that gap, you start reclaiming something that was slowly taken from you without you noticing your state. Not your connection, not the relationship, your internal state. The way you feel when nothing external is pulling you in different directions. And at first, it's unstable. You'll still feel the pull, still feel the need to react, still feel that familiar tension when they disappear again. But instead of immediately moving toward it, you begin to observe it. You notice how your body tightens, how your mind starts searching for explanations, how quickly your focus shifts away from yourself and toward them. And instead of following that movement, you let it be there. You don't suppress it, you don't act on it, you just watch it. And that's where the real shift begins. Because the moment you stop feeding the reaction, the pattern loses momentum. Not completely, not instantly, but enough for you to feel the difference. The urgency starts to fade. The need to fix, to solve, to restore something that was never stable in the first place begins to weaken. And what replaces it is something unfamiliar. Stillness, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels like nothing is pulling you away from yourself. And from that place, your perspective changes. You're no longer inside the loop, reacting to every shift. You're slightly outside of it, watching it unfold. You see when they come back, you see when they pull away, but it doesn't hit the same because your emotional state is no longer tied directly to their behavior. And that's where boundaries begin to form, not as rules you force onto yourself, but as natural responses to what you're now aware of. You don't have to tell yourself to stop overgiving. It just starts to feel unnecessary. You don't have to remind yourself to hold back. Your system does it automatically because it no longer trusts the pattern in the same way. And silence, something that used to feel heavy, starts to feel different. It's no longer a space where you wait for them to return. It becomes a space where you return to yourself. You stop filling it with overthinking, with imagined conversations, with attempts to predict what they're doing or why they're acting a certain way. You let it exist without needing to control it. And in that silence, something stabilizes. Your nervous system, which has been constantly reacting, finally gets a chance to settle. The highs and lows start to even out. Not because they've changed, but because you're no longer riding every fluctuation. And this is where detachment begins, not as indifference, not as pretending you don't care, but as clarity. You still see them, you still understand them, but you're no longer trying to manage the connection. You're no longer trying to make something work that requires both sides to be equally present. And that realization removes a weight you didn't even realize you were carrying. Because trying to stabilize something alone is exhausting. Trying to maintain balance when the structure itself is unstable will always drain you. And once you stop doing that, once you stop stepping in to fix every shift, to close every gap, to interpret every silence, your energy starts to return. Slowly at first, but noticeably. You feel less pulled, less reactive, less dependent on what happens next. And from that place, your standards change, not because you decided they should, but because your experience has shown you the difference between what drains you and what doesn't. You begin to recognize that consistency isn't something you have to earn. That clarity isn't something you have to fight for. That connection isn't supposed to feel like something you're constantly trying to secure. And once you've felt the absence of that chaos, once you've experienced what it's like to not be in a constant state of anticipation, it becomes very difficult to go back. Not because you're forcing yourself to move on, but because the pattern no longer holds the same value. It no longer feels like something worth engaging with. And that's where your power actually is. Not in making them stay, not in understanding them better, not in adjusting yourself until everything aligns. Your power is in your ability to not participate in something that disrupts your internal state, to not feed a pattern that requires your energy to continue, to recognize when something pulls you out of alignment and choose not to follow it. And that choice, even when it's small, even when it's inconsistent at first, is what breaks the loop. Not all at once, but piece by piece, because the pattern doesn't survive without your response. And once you begin to see that clearly, once you feel the difference between reacting and choosing, you stop asking how to control the connection. And you start realizing you were never meant to. At some point, without any announcement, without any dramatic ending, you realize something has changed. Not in them, they still move the same way, still come close, and then disappear, still reach out just when the distance starts to feel final. But this time, something is different. You don't feel the same pull. The message comes in, and instead of that immediate shift in your body, that rush of relief, that instinct to respond and reopen everything, there's space. Not resistance, not force, just space. And in that space, you see it clearly for what it is. Not a moment of connection, not a sign that things are finally aligning, just another repetition of the same pattern you've already lived through too many times. And that clarity doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't feel empowering in the way people usually describe it. It feels quiet, almost neutral. Because for the first time, you're not reacting to what's happening, you're observing it. You're not inside the loop anymore, you're looking at it from the outside. And once you reach that point, something very specific begins to happen. The questions that used to run through your mind start to disappear. You're no longer asking why they pulled away. You're no longer trying to decode their behavior. You're no longer searching for hidden meanings in simple actions because you already know, not intellectually, but experientially. You've seen it enough times to recognize it without needing to analyze it again. And when you no longer need to analyze something, it loses its hold over you because analysis is what kept you engaged. It's what made it feel like there was something to figure out, something to solve, something that could still change if you just understood it deeply enough. But now there's nothing left to solve, only something to accept. And acceptance, real acceptance, doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like seeing something exactly as it is without trying to reshape it into something else. You see that the connection never lacked intensity, it lacked consistency. You see that the moments that felt real were real, but they were never stable. And most importantly, you see that none of it was leading anywhere different than where it has always led. And that realization does something subtle but irreversible. It removes the illusion of future, because what kept you attached wasn't just what was happening, it was what you believed could happen. the version of this that finally works, the version where they stay, where everything stabilizes, where all the confusion finally turns into clarity. But once you've seen the pattern enough times, that version stops feeling real. It starts to feel imagined. And when the imagined future loses its weight, the present becomes easier to step away from. Not because it's painful, but because it no longer offers anything new. And that's when the final shift happens. Not in a single decision, not in one moment where you suddenly walk away and never look back, but in a series of small choices that all move in the same direction. You don't respond the same way. You don't engage the same way. You don't give the same energy to something that hasn't changed. And over time, those small choices create distance. Not forced distance, natural distance. The kind that comes from no longer being pulled in. And eventually you reach a point where their presence or absence no longer defines how you feel. They can come back, they can leave again, and it doesn't create the same reaction. Not because you've shut down, not because you've stopped caring entirely, but because your system is no longer attached to the cycle. And this is where most people misunderstand what healing looks like. They think it's about forgetting, about moving on quickly, about replacing one connection with another. But what actually changes is much quieter than that. You don't lose the memory. You lose the attachment to the pattern. You no longer need it to resolve. You no longer need them to explain, to apologize, or to finally become consistent, because the closure you were waiting for was never something they could give you. It was something you had to arrive at yourself. And once you do, something unexpected happens. You stop wanting them to come back, not out of anger, not out of bitterness, but because their return no longer offers anything you need. It doesn't complete anything. It doesn't fix anything. It just repeats something you've already outgrown. And that's the part most people don't talk about. The moment where the attachment dissolves, not because the other person changed, but because you did, because you stopped participating in something that required you to ignore your own clarity, because you stopped chasing a version of connection that only existed in brief moments and never in reality. And maybe the most important shift of all is this: you don't see it as something you lost anymore. You see it as something you understood, something that showed you exactly where your energy was going and why it kept leaving you feeling the same way. And once you understand that deeply enough that you don't question it anymore, you don't go back, not because you can't, but because you no longer want to. And maybe for the first time, it's not that they didn't come back. It's that even if they did, you wouldn't be there waiting anymore.